So we're going to start our culture class, and this is Dr. Ron Kaufman, drove up from San Diego today, so we're very fortunate to have him. He's a professor at USD.
No C.
USD.
Sorry.
Yes.
So I'm not going to worry you with anything else.
Because the rest of it's really boring, I promise you. Thank you, George. So what I'm going to try to talk to you about in the time available is how do you care for imported orchids? And how many of you have ever bought an orchid from an international vendor at a show that came in either bare root or just wrapped in moss, but not in a pot, not established on anything, just orchid and nothing else? How many of you done that before? Okay, excellent. How many of you have not had good success with some of those orchids? Okay, so this is not the absolute formula that is going to work. This is just some things to think about when you're thinking about buying imported orchids. So first of all, why would you ever buy an imported orchid as opposed to buying an established orchid from somebody local? Why would you ever buy one from that's bare root or something?
You like the color.
You like the color? Okay. Challenge, right? Okay, it could be like, can I do this? Yes. Okay, you'll get over that eventually.
Cheap price.
Price. Sometimes they're cheap. Actually, hopefully, they're less expensive. Any other reasons? That you didn't have it before, and sometimes, at least for me, sometimes there are plants that you can't get anywhere else. So, and you have to have them because, well, I don't need to explain to you why you have to have an orchid. So all I'm going to try to do is give you some things to think about in terms of how to care for imported orchids, and maybe tell you a few things that I found that help to increase the success of establishing imported orchids as opposed to letting them just sort of dwindle and eventually fade.
Can I interrupt real quickly?
No.
I think this talk is especially important because our speaker next month is going to be Gustavo Aguirre from Colombia, and he'll be bringing a lot of bare root. The plant table will be bare root plants.
Oh, good.
No pressure.
Excellent, yeah, you've just made this relevant. And Gustavo sells mostly but not exclusively Callias, so he has sort of a variety of things. All right, so here are some things to think about. And this is just sort of an overview, and then I'm going to go through each one of these. The way I do culture classes, when I do culture classes, is they're pretty interactive. So if you have questions or comments or things you want to throw in as I'm talking, don't feel like you have to, it's a talk, I can't interrupt the talk, just shout it out. So the first thing to think about is what condition is the plant in? Sometimes when you pre-order plants and then the vendor brings them in, you get what you get. But if you don't pre-order plants and you get to poke through what's in a sales booth, you can make choices about which plants you choose to buy and which plants you say, I'm going to give that a pass. So one of the conditions is, one of the things is, are they established or are they bare root? And you may be saying to yourself, well, this is ridiculous. You just told me that they're all bare root. Not quite. There are certain kinds of media that people can bring in with orchids. So for example, you'll sometimes find orchid. So in general, the US has restrictions on certain kinds of imports. One of those is imports on wood. So you'll never see orchids that are established on wood. But people have gotten creative about how to establish an orchid on something else and then import it. So they will establish them sometimes on tree fern, although that's in some countries also getting scarce. They may establish them on coconut shells. They may establish them, there's a vendor from Asia who actually establishes them in a little piece of green plastic mesh with coconut fiber in between. And other examples, I've seen coconut fiber over PVC. I've seen, this was highly illegal, but I've seen things on other kinds of illegal to export from the country of origin, okay, in the United States, materials from various countries. So sometimes you do get things that are actually established on something. And then the question is, what do you do about the something? Do you just leave it on the something, or do you transition it to something else? And I'll talk a little bit about that. You want to pay attention to hydration. Is the plant really dehydrated? If it is, the more dehydrated it is, the less the chances that you'll be successful with it. So you want to look at that. Does it have roots? If it does have roots, how do the roots look? What should you expect? Things like that. We'll talk about growth form. There's a big difference between importing or buying an imported plant that has pseudobulbs versus a plant that doesn't have pseudobulbs. You're going to want to think about season. What time of year is it? and what kind of plant are you importing, where's it coming from, compared to the temperature requirements that you may have in your conditions. And think about what the effects are of changing hemisphere, if it comes from the southern hemisphere, for example, which they often might, and then some problems that can come up. So these are sort of the major topics I'm going to talk about in this next maybe 10 or 12 minutes. So the first one, as I mentioned, is you want to look at the condition of the plant. Some plants can come established on coconut, sorry, that's not coconut, can come established on tree fern, like that. They can sometimes come established on coconut husk or other things. And one of the things that I've gotten accustomed to is that if it's established, I will almost always, if it's got new root growth, or as soon as it has new root growth, I will almost always take it off of whatever it was mounted on and put it on something that I'm more familiar with. And let me explain why this happens, or why I do this. Not all tree fern is the same. Some tree fern is very soft and very dense. Some tree fern is very rigid and will last a long time. But one of the challenges is, kind of like buying a potted plant, you don't know the history of that item. So you don't know whether that tree fern is relatively good conditions, that the chemistry is good, or whether it's about to break down and is going to take the root system with it. So you want to be a little bit concerned about that. And what I'll usually do after the plant has new root growth and when it's time to take it off is I'll take it off of whatever it's on, I'll put it on a new piece of whatever I'm going to grow it on, something I'm familiar with because I've already used it, and that way I have a better sense of what the plant's likely to do. But if the roots aren't in good shape, or the roots aren't actively growing, it usually means it's a bad time to peel it off and expect it to establish. What was that? You weren't expecting a presentation? Ah. All right, well, I don't know if that's good or bad, but anyway. So that's something to consider. What's it established on, and what's the history of the stuff that's established on? If they're bare root, a lot of times vendors will bring them in wrapped in a little ball of sphagnum moss. What I used to do is I used to say, oh, well, undoubtedly that's the good sphagnum moss, so I'm just going to pot it up in that and something else. Bad idea. So now what I do is, if it's wrapped in sphagnum moss, I will take the opportunity to add some lovely imported sphagnum compost to my garden. And I will put fresh sphagnum moss, where again, I know the history of it. I know I tend to try to use good quality, long fibered sphagnum moss. So I'll put it in something where I'm more familiar with the properties of the growing medium. And if it has no medium at all, then I'm going to try to put it into something that I think will allow the plant to establish well. Now I'll give you an example. I used to, with imported cattleyas, I used to get them in, and if they had new root growth, no problem, I'd put them into the bark mix that I often use for cattleyas. But if they didn't have new root growth, I'd still put them in the bark mix. And for me at least, that didn't always work well, because I was always walking this line between, do I water it a lot because it looks like it needs it? Do I underwater it to encourage new root growth, but it already looks a little desiccated, so now what do I do? So there's some uncertainty there. What I will now do, if I'm really not sure and I think the plant needs some help, even for a cattleya or something that normally grows pretty dry, is I'll pot it in sphagnum moss, which is, in my growing conditions, absolutely wonderful stuff. And I'll put it in, if it's something like a cattleya, for example, I'll put it in a very, very, very small clay pot, so that it will hold moisture, because sphagnum's nice and spongy, but it'll still dry out fairly quickly, which is what plants would often experience in habitat. And once the roots get started, then I can make some decisions about what I really want to do with it. But just to get it established, I'll often use under-potted clay pot and a little bit of sphagnum moss, and I find that combination works pretty well. And I picked up a little tip from Tom Perliti, who used to run still runs Golden Gate Orchids, but not as a commercial venture, one of the most phenomenal growers of orchids in the state of California, which is when you pot in a clay pot, I always put a styrofoam peanut in the bottom to make sure the drain hole doesn't get clogged with the moss so it doesn't stay too wet. And I've seen other people handle that differently. I know a guy who will take clay pots, turn them upside down, take a hammer and knock out the bottom of the pot for the same reason. But this way I don't take the risk of shattering the pot or my hand. And it does the same thing. You just don't want the drain hole to be blocked with moss, which can sometimes happen. So that's what I typically do for bare root plants. And then pay attention to whether or not the plant is desiccated. If it's a little bit desiccated and you really want it, and the root system looks okay, you might want to take a shot. If it's really, really badly desiccated, I would say no matter how badly you want it, you may just want to leave it on the table. I've sometimes bought desiccated plants that I really, really, really wanted or that were very special and had to worry about rehydrating them. And it doesn't always work well, no matter how much you care for the plant. And then you always want to pay attention to whether or not there are roots, and if so, how those roots look. And I'll get to the roots a little bit later. Growth form. This is actually kind of a big deal, a bigger deal than I ever thought it was. So there are some plants that have no pseudobulbs, and you all know pseudobulbs are a place to store water and energy. And so, for example, pleurothalids don't have pseudobulbs. There are soft-leaf plants like pescatorias and caphorsteinias and things like that. There are slipper orchids that don't have pseudobulbs. And then there are vandaceous plants like phalaenopsis and so forth. And it's important to remember that if a plant that doesn't have pseudobulbs looks a little off, it may or may not have enough energy to push out new roots and recover well. And I'm not saying that that's categorically true, right? I've seen people who live in South Florida, for example, buy vandaceous plants that I would look at and say, oh, boy, I would never get that plant. But they live in South Florida. And they can water it twice a day. And some horrendous looking vandaceous plants that you put in South Florida and water twice a day will just pop new roots and start growing like gangbusters. I'm more skeptical of my own conditions for doing that, so I tend not to go that route. One other thing I found in doing a lot of imported plants is I find that, especially soft leaf things like Huntleas, caphorsteinias, things like that, they tend to trap moisture in new growths. And when you put them in a box and ship them somewhere for several days, there's going to be water condensation that's going to get in all kinds of little cracks and crevices where it's going to potentially foster bacterial growth. And so what I find is that whenever I've in the past I've imported some of these things, if there's a new growth that's only partially developed, I can almost invariably count on losing it. Same thing is true with stanhopias, lycastes, anything that's got tight leaves and a new growth coming, 8 out of 10 times I'll lose it, no matter what. So if you've got a plant that looks really great and it's got like, so for example, if I have a choice, if I have 2 plants that I'm looking at, one of these soft leaf plants has all mature growths and no new growths, and the other one has a couple mature growths and a couple of promising looking new growths, I will go for the one that only has mature growths. Because I'm less likely to lose them, the growths are already mature, versus the ones that are just coming up. Okay, so just some things that I've noticed. When they do have pseudobulbs, then you've got various kinds of pseudobulbs. There are some that have, I would say, smooth and hard leaves, like Cattleyas, Dendrobiums, Lalias, Myrmecophilus, things like that. These invariably are pretty resistant to whatever. You can put them in a box, ship them somewhere, the box can get lost for 2 months. Eventually make its way to you, you'll open the box, and they'll look like they did when they went in the box. Which is sort of amazing, actually, if you think about it. There are some that have soft leaves, like bulbophyllums, cymbidiums, and so forth. Those tend to be a little more sensitive. And in my experience, again, you can often lose growths, especially partially developed growths. And then I already mentioned something about plicated leaves, the things like lycastes and so forth. The nice thing about all of these is, if you lose the new growths, they've got pseudobulbs. And they almost certainly have good eyes, but you should look around and make sure. And then if they do, I think you can take a lot of risks because you've got a lot of energy in the bulb and you've got a good eye, and it's probably going to be okay. Okay. Does that make sense, like in terms of that distinction? Yeah.
Ron, what is your thoughts on bagging some of these pseudobulb plants to get them going?
Bagging meaning putting them in like 100% humidity in a plastic bag,
Right.
as opposed to bagging like, you know. So here's my thought. I think it depends on how the plant looks, and it depends on your level of comfort with. So the trade-off is the high humidity can be pretty helpful in terms of encouraging new growth and getting the plant to like recover from being desiccated. The downside is that most of these plants have spent days in a box, and there are all kinds of fungi and bacteria that can start to become present or better developed when they're in the box. And my guess in most cases is that keeping it too humid is going to probably lead to more fungal and bacterial problems. So if you can avoid it, I would say what you want is high humidity and air movement, which is hard to do in a plastic bag. But you could do, you know, in a terrarium or something if you wanted to go that route. But that's my experience has been I have more problems with established plants and fungal and bacterial problems than I do with desiccation problems. And part of it is because it can be hard to know when they left wherever it is they originated. Sometimes they can be in the box for 3, 4, 5, 7, 10 days, and a lot of problems can develop in that time. So that's my thinking.
Thanks.
Another thing I want to mention that is actually pretty important, and I've gotten much more militant about this as time has gone by, as time of year. So my general rule of thumb is the following. I will never import cool growers at the beginning of the summer. I bought at one point a Dendrobium cuthbertsonii, some of you are giggling already, a high elevation New Guinea Dendrobium species in June. Brought it to Southern California, not right on the ocean, and I've never seen a plant die so fast. Actually, I mean, really, it was like, a week it was gone. So there's two things to think about. One thing to think about is, what's the temperature requirement of your plant versus the time of year? So I will import cool growers in the late summer, early fall. I will import warm growers in the spring, early summer. Pretty much always. And I won't import cool growers when we're about to go into our warm season, and I won't import warm growers when we are about to go into shorter days, winter. And that seems to be a pretty good rule of thumb. So think about what even if you're at a show and you think, oh, that looks so wonderful, but here it is, September, and this is a warm grower from wherever. Think about what the plant's going to experience. So that's just sort of in general. Spring, summer, intermediate to warm and warm growers, fall, intermediate to cool growers. Also remember that most importers will bring their plants through Miami, which is capital H, capital O, capital T, and so sometimes your plants you have to think about where the plants transition. Now, if they were air conditioned the whole way, it's not a huge problem most times. But I have seen plants unpacked in California that went through Miami, and you see a lot of heat damage. So pay attention. Another thing, this is not on the slides, pay attention to what else the vendor has going on in their booth. Sometimes you'll see a bunch of nice looking plants on top, and you look underneath and there's a box half full of like yellow burned plants. And what that tells you is at least some of their plants got heat damaged, and it may be that the ones on the top are fine, and it may be that they just haven't started to show the signs yet. So just sometimes you'll actually see, like, a show starts on Friday, ends on Sunday, and you'll see plants that look great on Friday and they look horrible by Sunday. So things to pay attention to. Remember, this is just to think about, not to like be a caution. Just remember that change of hemisphere will sometimes change the flowering cycles. So you bring in a plant from the southern hemisphere, it may skip a year, and it may take it a couple years to get on our growth cycle. And so don't be too alarmed if, I've had this plant for a year and a half and it hasn't bloomed. It's probably still in Rio, or wishing it was in Rio. And then this is something that I can only say happens from experience. Some plants deal better with the change of climate than others, and one of the things I think might be going on is that some nurseries grow their plants really hard. Like, they don't baby them, they treat them as though they're a little bit more robust. And other nurseries really like pump them up with fertilizer and get them looking really lush, and I would say grow them soft. If you grow succulents or anything like that, you know what I'm talking about. And plants that are grown hard will usually adapt much better to new conditions than plants that are grown soft and look lush and fat and only know how to grow well in greenhouse conditions. So just something to pay attention to. And I've learned from experience that, for example, some vendors' plants always establish well for me and others never do. And they're from the same country, from similar areas. So. And then there are some problems to pay attention to. So if you have no roots or bad roots, that can be something to be very, very cautious of, like that Oncidium. It's got shriveled pseudobulbs, it's got no good roots. So if you see that for sale, and I've seen things like that for sale, you may want to just leave it on the table, even if that's the Oncidium you've been looking for the last 10 years. And then you call Andy, and Andy says, oh yeah, I got 20 of those, you want one? I've had that experience a bunch of times too. You want to make sure that you look very, very closely for damage. Is there a little damage hidden here and there? Turn the plant around really well, look underneath. Sometimes there's something that's not obvious that you can spot if you really look closely. And I've learned over the years that, as I said before in response to your question, bacterial and fungal infection can be my biggest enemies. And so what I will often do if I think a plant's just come out of the box is I will actually treat it with a systemic, like spray it with a systemic fungicide, something like Subdue Max or Clearies or something like that, and then let it dry completely before I do anything else with it. And I've found that actually has reduced my losses dramatically. It's not 100%, But one of the other things to consider is that sometimes there's some bacterial or fungal infection that's gotten started in the box or somewhere along the line. And sometimes, even when you treat it, it looks like the symptoms have stopped. Sometimes they're still there, and you may have to keep an eye out and spray them again when symptoms reappear or when you're concerned about it. So my experience has been that bacterial and fungal infections, once they're established even a little bit, typically don't go away, which is kind of unfortunate. And, but a little bit of preventative medicine can help a lot. And then don't worry too much if your plant is slow to establish. Some plants will, they'll just pop out new roots and start growing right away. And others, I mean, I've had some plants that literally sat and did nothing for 9 months. I was like, what is going on? The plant's not dead. It's just sitting there, going like this. And sometimes you just have to be patient. Patience. That's the hard one, right? So sometimes you just have to be patient. And that's, I think, more than I have time for, and probably about all I have to say. Does anybody have any questions or experiences, anything like that?
Have you ever thought about doing a molasses mixture?
I've done that. So what she means by a molasses mixture is not like mixing your orchid with molasses and pouring it over your pancakes, although that could be interesting too. There are some people, so I've done that with deflasking. Glenn Barfield, who used to be at the Orchid Works, told me about that. So what she's saying is you basically take water and just put a couple drops of molasses in it, and there's a set of complex sugars, complex carbohydrates, and sometimes people combine that with Super Thrive, same thing, so you have water, molasses, and Super Thrive. The idea is that the orchids, if they're low on nutrients, will actually be able to take up some of those carbohydrates if you soak them in it. And so I've done that. I actually, at one point, got into this whole thing where I was like, okay, I'm going to deflask one flask with molasses and another flask without molasses. And I did some side-by-side comparisons. Same with some imports. I never noticed much of a difference, but I was only doing like one of this and one of that.
Has anybody ever used
But they do get sticky if you don't wash them off.
honey as an antibacterial?
I'm sure somebody has. I've never tried that.
I was just curious.
Yeah. I mean, sphagnum moss is nice because it seems to have some antifungal properties by
okay.
itself, so it's good as a potting medium for
Oh,
that
I didn't
reason.
know that. That's interesting.
Although if you're talking to your friends who live in South Florida, they think sphagnum is just evil.
Oh, well, I can understand.
Yeah, it falls apart pretty quickly and it'll take the root system with it. Okay. Well, I hope this helps a little bit, and
Yeah,
try if you can.